want to hear from both of you. How did this become an important issue to you?
For me, it started, I've always been interested in the Middle East. I'm an anthropologist who thinks about questions around race and citizenship and identity and such in the United States for sure, but also in the Middle East and particularly in Africa. I mean, particularly in Palestine. And I also think a lot about sort of the Black Muslim diaspora. So there are all these things that brought me into the region. But I became increasingly interested after I worked at CNN. I started to engage. They would bring me on to debate Dershowitz, just as I'm just the generic Democratic strategist. Although I've never been a Democrat in my life, right. I was just Black, right? So and they brought me there. It's like on the old growing up, like the old WWF matches where like whoever the star is, you'd come out and he'd wrestle some tomato can you never heard of before. And, the match would go 2 minutes and the fans would cheer. The idea was they brought me on because they thought I didn't know anything about it. And that AlanDershowitz would just mop the floor with me and keep going, or that I would agree with him, and we wouldn't have a real conversation. I have a graduate degree in Middle Eastern studies. So it didn't go the way they wanted it to.
They have an international responsibility, according to Hague Regulations, Article 47, according to all sorts of international law, to treat Gaza very differently. That's the point.
Just wrong.
Alan?
Just wrong. That's just wrong. Israel ended its occupation completely in 2005.
That's untrue.
And between 2005 and 2007.
That's disingenuous.
No, it's absolutely true.
Well, let me respond.
Hang on, Alan. Why is it not true? Why is it not true?
It's not true. It's not true because there are international standards for occupation. They still control electromagnetic space, the airspace, the naval space, the population registry. Every single measure of occupation they meet, they satisfy all the conditions for occupation.
According to the United States government, Israel occupies Gaza.
Exactly.
A military occupation can continue until the military threat is over. That is clear under international law.
Alan, so now you're at least conceding the fact that there is a military occupation.
But then that got me more engaged in the topic. And then Ferguson Summer happened, and Mike Brown was killed on August 9th of 2014. And I was in Ferguson covering it, and I was on the ground. And at the same time, of course, Operation Protective Edge was happening in Gaza for 51 days. And so there was a lot of solidarity. There was a lot of conversation. There was a lot of overlap. There's all this cool stuff happening. And I ended up going on a delegation to Palestine with the Dream Defenders that January of 2015. And while I was on the ground there, it's hard to see that and look away, I already had an intellectual understanding. I'd already been studying and reading about the issue for a long time. But being on the ground in East Jerusalem, where I've spent the last decade, almost 9 years doing anthropological research. But being on the ground in East Jerusalem, being on the ground in the West Bank, being on the ground in Hebron in particular, being even inside the state of Israel and seeing these things on the ground, it just dramatically changed how I thought about it and what I thought my role as an American was and what solidarity looked like to me. And so I became more engaged with it. And the more engaged I got, the more resistance I experienced. The more resistance I experienced, the more I was like, oh shit, I must be on to something here. And I just kept drilling down.
Yeah.
And so that became the thing.
Marc, I'm curious. I mean, that point about the resistance really resonates with me because I remember, Marc, I had you on Bad Faith like years ago to talk about Progressive Except for Palestine. And I remember feeling very nervous about that conversation. And I remember asking you about the UN speech and like, well, what was it? Coming from a fairly naive place, like what was it that was supposed to be so controversial? And remember us kind of having a back and forth, I think, with the co-writer of your book about, river to the sea, and there's this interpretation and that interpretation. And it feels like another planet now that we've kind of blasted through that discourse. People, the irony is that the overtime window seems to have shifted dramatically in favor of being able to say, there were people, even Norm, God bless them, I love him, but even Norm was kind of doing a little bit of the tone policing of the sloganing, especially earlier on, closer to October 7th. But I think it's been kind of demonstrated that you kind of come off as a weepy scold, not Norm, but like the Zionist, angry people, like a weepy scold when you're the one that's focusing on a slogan and the sloganeers are focusing on tens of thousands of people who have been brutally killed and another almost 100,000 people who have been injured in an entire population of millions that are starving to death, right? So there is something optimistic about that, but it is interesting to reflect back on the timidity that I brought to the conversation, and the fear that I had even trying to engage with it as a podcaster who wanted to know more from an expert like yourself in a safe space of my own podcast, because it had been telegraphed so loudly that this was a hot button issue. I didn't even have like a real job, I think, at the time. I think I was only just still podcasting. And I still felt like I might lose something, even if it was only reputational harm. And I wonder, I mean, how are you thinking about that now? Like, when you listen back to your speech?
To not just offer solidarity in words, but to commit to political action, grassroots action, local action, and international action that will give us what justice requires. And that is a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
Do you think it was the river to the sea part? And how are you feeling about that slogan now? Like,
I think river to the sea was my I think river to the sea was my eye roll, you know?
Yeah.
Had I not said it, they would have found something. And very similarly, most of the people who were outraged at it, you know, I had never heard it before. They were walking. If you had asked them 5 minutes before the newspaper headlines came out, you know, what do you think when you think river to the sea? They would have said nothing, right? So it was a manufactured outrage. It wasn't written into my speech.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I don't know if I would have written it. I probably would not have, just because it's, you know, but I was, you know, I was feeling it, you know, in the moment. And again, I hadn't finished the speech, and that was the last couple of minutes, and that's where the freestyle came in. So I don't know, you know, sort of where my brain would have gone. But after I said it, I didn't feel like I had crossed some crazy line, because I knew enough about river to the sea to understand just how widely that phrase is used and how differently it's used in different political spaces, from Likud to mainstream liberal Zionists to PFLP to PLO to Hamas, and etc. So I understood as it's almost like a floating signifier. It means lots of different things to lots of different people. But it was something easy to seize upon. But it's important to understand that wasn't the first thing they seized upon. There had been leaks in the Daily. Other newspapers that had said that, you know, there are concerns about Marc Lamont Hill at CNN, right? And there were like 2 or 3 other mini controversies that I was able to put out, like fires I was able to put out, where I was accused of doing something that I didn't do, and I was a kid, you know. But then by the time the 4th thing comes, or the 3rd thing comes, it's like, okay, well, he has a reputation for doing this kind of thing. Similarly,
this isn't the first time.
Right, this isn't the first time. Just like they could say, you know, Brianna Joy Gray called for the demographic destruction of Israel, or she called for the end to the Jewish state. And it's like, yeah, she didn't call for the end of Jewish people. She called for a secular democratic state to be created. And that's okay, even if you disagree with it. But because that became the discourse, and then it shifts to this, it's like, so in the back of people's minds, like, there's always a thing with her. There's always a thing with her about the Jews, and she must be anti-Semitic, right? If Marc is always being misunderstood, then maybe it's him, right? And so that it becomes harder. So they manufacture the outrage in a steady campaign, right? And so I don't know if it would have mattered. I just don't think it would have. If I had not said river to the sea, it would have been something else.
There were a series of Daily Beast hit pieces on me as well. I just Googled it to remind myself. The first one was on October 16th, so they didn't really waste any time. But what I remember about that one was that it was like, they're shouting at the Hill and some people are concerned. And then they framed it as though they cited a specific instance, framed it as though I was the one shouting, but I think that's the one where Robbie screamed the F word at me. And that is a part of why the eye roll stuff is so eye rollable. Because I mean, if the decorum arguments are undermined by the lack of decorum.
He threw a pen. He threw a pen at you too.
He threw a pen. He called me a simpleton. He shouted the F word on air, like over and over and over. And I'm not saying that I didn't give back at the same time, but I certainly never shouted duck in the middle of a segment and like threatened to walk off and throw my pen and all of that sort of a thing. And you know, there's a layer of like racial and gender coding to all of this. There's a lot going on, but it felt very clear that the Hill was willing to, and people at the Hill leaked to that for that story and other stories, were willing to kind of see the ground and see, like, to your point, Marc, to set kind of expectations that Brianna is this like loud, angry Black woman who can't control herself, particularly when it comes to Israel, and that therefore someone will buy a decorum argument. Like they basically set the stage for what the kind of internet troll, the Zionist troll who manufactured many of these crises, eventually capitalized on, which was this perception that a flicker of an eye at the end of a segment, at least when attached to a person who looks like me, is a fireable offense. But Robbie, and I'm not trying to make this about Robbie, but Robbie literally screaming F at me on air. Oh, and not even to mention the kind of like factual issues where, I mean, there was a clip going around last week where we were debating the question of whether or not the 40 beheaded baby story hoax was real months after the Biden campaign had already been forced to retract Joe Biden, saying that he had seen images with his own eyes. And so this is why it was getting heated, right?
And it is interesting that there have been no calls to censor. I mean, it's not the same for the President of the United States, obviously, but to even ask for an apology or a personal retraction from Joe Biden after lying about the 40 beheaded babies that have yet to materialize. His campaign, his administration got away with putting a retraction out to the press without him ever, as I understand it to date, being asked about why he specifically averred that he had seen evidence of something that even the IDF said that they had no evidence of.
That's not true. It's been shared on social media. The Israeli government has said this is the picture we've shown Joe Biden.
That is literally not. That is not true, Robbie.
It is absolutely true. How many times do you have to see pictures of blown apart children before you concede that they exist?
I see pictures of blown apart children every single day, Robbie. They're Palestinian children. What I have not seen...
So you're saying there are no Israeli blown apart children? What is wrong with you? I just don't get it.
Robbie, we're sitting here in front of the computer right now. How about you pull up the confirmation that there were 40 beheaded Israeli children that were found at that location that was reported by that is Israeli news report on that day. And we finally follow up that the White House retracted its retraction of its own story, which said Joe Biden misspoke. He did not, in fact, see visual confirmation of 40 beheaded babies. And show me where the Israeli media that very specifically said we cannot.
Listen to yourself.
I'm hearing myself loud and clear, Robbie. Watch the video of the IDF soldiers going into the hospital.
Right.
Wait a minute, Robbie.
Everything the terrorists say is accurate. Everything Israel says is inaccurate.
Let's talk about this.
You're a simpleton when it comes to this.
Every leftist in America was asked to apologize for some random protest. They should apologize. They should apologize for their endorsement of terrorist attacks on innocent Israeli civilians, just as I am outraged by the retaliatory actions that are killing innocent Palestinian children everywhere. I care about both of these things, and have said I care about both of these things over and over again. It is you and the idiotic, leftist, terrorist-sympathizing people who do not care about the dead Israelis.
The Harvard newspaper said exactly what the editorial page of Israel's major newspapers.
I don't give a Brianna.
Because I'm in a situation where, because we don't do reporting on these things, everything just has to come off as an editorial, like my radar and my opinion. Even when it's very difficult to establish a factual record, and then it becomes a subject of debate. Did Biden actually retract the 40 beheaded baby story? Well, Brianna says she did. Well, no, if we had just done a segment on it, then it wouldn't be as contentious, but they refused to do many of these things outside of the context of me doing an opinion-based radar.
And that, I think, speaks to why, because they wanted to be able to relegate it to feelings and opinions as opposed to facts.
Right.
Even though
there were no consequences for other people getting facts so dramatically wrong, so loudly, and with such, frankly, dismissive disdain for their coworker while they were making wrong arguments.
If you saw this live, you were so in luck because you got to see that whole stream with me and Brianna Joy Gray